Hello, everyone. This is the weekly review for AP World History from March 22nd to March 26th as we continue to examine Unit 8, the Cold War and Decolonization. We began by focusing on the spread of communism after 1900, and specifically in China. Students were asked to explain the causes and consequences of China's adoption of communism. Causes included things such as the strategic balance that favored the communists over the nationalists at the end of World War II, and the fact that the nationalist government was corrupt, which led the citizens of the country to lean more towards sympathizing with the communists. Consequences included the embracing of Maoist ideology after the revolution, and the fact that the Cultural Revolution began sort of an ideological purist form of communism. It was a youth movement in the 1960s that basically pushed back against any counter-communism movement that might have been afoot in China. We also talked about decolonization after 1900. Students were asked to compare the processes by which various peoples pursued independence after 1900. We reviewed the decolonization process for several countries, including India, Vietnam, and Nigeria. We then analyzed each process in each country as to whether or not there was a negotiated peace or an armed conflict. There seemed to be about a 50-50 split between the various countries that we analyzed. And we determined who the major leaders and parties involved in each of the movements were toward decolonization. And lastly, we determined whether each was a regional movement, a religious movement, or an ethnic movement, or some combination of the three. On Tuesday, I was out. I asked students to work on the following: the DBQ graphic organizer and 2 Google Classroom assignments, newly independent states, and global resistance to establish power structures. Our 4-class focus throughout the week changed. We looked at previous responses from an earlier exit ticket in order to prepare for the exit ticket that you filled out for Respect on Monday. And then we switched to a new executive functioning skill, which was ownership of learning, for the remainder of the week. On Thursday, we conducted a writing prompt. We looked at a primary source, which was Eisenhower's farewell address, where he warned against the military industrial complex. So we answered questions such as, what did Eisenhower mean by the military industrial complex? And again, what he meant by that was this sort of combination of political and business forces that were working towards establishing an exorbitant amount of defense contracts. And Eisenhower was worried that this combination of power would result in a lessening or a weakening of the nation's democracy or democratic principles. So this is why he was warning the American people against it. And we talked about that. We also analyzed whether the American people and policymakers in the ensuing 60 years since the address had heeded Eisenhower's warning, and talked about why or why not. Generally speaking, we kind of came to the conclusion that the American policymakers had difficulty heeding Eisenhower's warning, and that indeed the military-industrial complex has been a contributing factor to foreign policy. We continue to work on the DBQ graphic organizer for the DBQ essay. Again, the essay focuses on the impact that the communist movement had on women's rights around the world. And at the end of the week, we reviewed the 2 assignments. Newly independent states was one of them. We compared the independent states of Israel, Cambodia, and Pakistan. And we based comparisons on territorial developments, demographic developments, and nationalist developments. The territorial developments around land ownership, boundaries, borders, things of that nature. Demographic developments about ethnic enclaves and different groups that ended up having to move and relocate because of these newly independent states. And the nationalist movements that developed within the newly independent states, where you had those enclaves that were trying to push back against it. Global resistance to existing power structures after 1900. Students were asked to explain various reactions to existing power structures: nonviolent resistance, challenges to Soviet power, 1968, the year of revolt, an age of terrorism, response to militarized states, and the military-industrial complex were all reviewed. What's coming up next? We'll continue Unit 8 on Cold War and decolonization.